At its peak, it held more than 10,000 patients behind one set of walls, making it, by every measure historians have been able to verify, the largest single mental institution ever built in the United States. Today, it sits almost entirely empty, miles of hallway gone quiet, hundreds of rooms left exactly as they were the day the last patients walked out. This is the true story of Ashworth State Hospital and how a single building came to hold more human beings than some American towns. Before we go further, if stories like this one matter to you, the kind that get buried under decades of paperwork until almost nobody remembers them, stick around, because what's still standing on that property today might surprise you. And if your own family ever had a connection to a place like this, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Ashworth was built in stages, starting in 1872, on a sprawling parcel of land just outside a mid-sized Midwestern city, chosen specifically, according to surviving planning documents, for its distance from the city center, far enough to keep patients appropriately separated from public life, in the planning committee's own words, but close enough for rail access to bring in supplies and, eventually, patients themselves, by the trainload. The original building, a single Kirkbride-style structure designed to house 600 patients, opened in 1874 to immediate and overwhelming demand. Within 5 years, the state was already adding wings. Within 20, it was adding entirely separate buildings: a children's facility, a tuberculosis ward, a forensic unit for patients committed through the criminal courts, a working farm complex with its own dairy barn and slaughterhouse, eventually even its own power plant, its own water treatment facility, its own fire department. By the early 1950s, Ashworth wasn't really a hospital anymore in any conventional sense. It was a small, self-contained city, built entirely around the business of institutionalizing people the rest of the country had decided it didn't know what else to do with. The numbers, even now, are difficult to fully absorb. At its peak population in 1955, Ashworth housed 10,431 patients across more than 70 separate buildings spread over 400 acres, a population larger than many of the small towns scattered across that same county. The medical and nursing staff required to care for a population that size, even at the inadequate ratios common to institutions of this era, numbered in the hundreds, supplemented by hundreds more support staff, cooks, groundskeepers, farm laborers, maintenance crews, many of them local residents for whom Ashworth was, for generations, simply the largest employer in the county. To understand how a single institution grew to this scale, you have to understand the broader pattern playing out across the entire country during this period. The same pattern we've discussed in other stories on this channel, where loose commitment standards, inadequate community alternatives, and a medical establishment that genuinely believed, with whatever mixture of compassion and overreach, that large centralized institutions were the answer to mental illness, combined to fill buildings like Ashworth far beyond anything their original architects had ever imagined. Commitment records that survive from Ashworth's middle decades show admissions for the full range of genuine psychiatric illness, but also for conditions we wouldn't recognize as requiring institutionalization today: epilepsy, postpartum depression, alcoholism, intellectual disabilities, and, with disturbing frequency in the records from the 1920s through the 1940s, simple poverty and old age, families and county welfare officers committing relatives for whom there was, quite literally, nowhere else to send them. The man most responsible for Ashworth's transformation from a single modest building into the sprawling complex it eventually became was its longest-serving superintendent, Dr. Reginald Aldous Pierce, who took over administration of the institution in 1903 and held the position for an extraordinary 38 years until his retirement in 1941. Pierce arrived at Ashworth as a relatively young physician with a genuine, by all surviving accounts sincerely held, ambition to modernize what he viewed as an outdated, overcrowded facility, and in his first decade in the role, his annual reports to the state legislature reflect a man pushing hard for exactly the kind of expansion that would, decades later, produce the very overcrowding crisis his successors would spend the rest of the century struggling to manage. Pierce's early reports, preserved in remarkably complete condition in the State Archive, make for a strange and revealing read today. His 1908 report to the legislature argues passionately for funding to construct additional wards, citing what he describes as an urgent humanitarian crisis of mentally ill residents across the state being held in inadequate county facilities, jails, and poorhouses for lack of any proper institutional alternative. Pierce's advocacy, by most historical accounts, was motivated by genuine concern for these populations rather than any desire to simply grow his own institution's footprint. But the practical effect of his decades of successful advocacy was the construction of building, ward after ward, each one filling almost immediately upon completion with a backlog of patients the state's existing institutions had nowhere else to place. By the 1920s, Pierce's own internal correspondence shows a man increasingly aware that the institution he'd helped build had outgrown any single administrator's ability to fully oversee it. A 1924 letter to a colleague at a comparable institution in a neighboring state, preserved in the same archive, includes a passage that researchers have since cited as a remarkably self-aware acknowledgement of the problem Pierce himself had helped create. "I confess to you," Pierce wrote, "that I no longer know, with any confidence, the full extent of what occurs within these walls on any given day. I receive reports, I review summaries, I tour wards as my schedule allows, but the institution has grown larger than any one man's direct knowledge can encompass, and I am not certain whether this represents a triumph of capacity or a failure of oversight. Perhaps, uncomfortably, it is both." Pierce continued to lead Ashworth for another 17 years after writing that letter, presiding over its continued growth, even as his own private correspondence suggests he understood, at least in part, the scale of the administrative challenge that growth represented. He retired in 1941 at the age of 68, and according to a lengthy retirement profile published in a state medical journal, spent his remaining years, he lived until 1953, largely declining to speak publicly about the institution's future direction, a silence that the journal's own writer found notable enough to comment on directly, speculating that Dr. Pierce, having given the better part of 4 decades to an institution whose scale even he came to view with some ambivalence, may simply have felt he had said what needed saying, and that the rest belonged to those who followed him. A nurse named Iris Thackeray, who worked at Ashworth from 1958 until the early stages of its decline in the 1970s, gave an extended interview to a regional oral history project in 1998, offering one of the most detailed surviving first-hand accounts of what daily life inside a facility of this scale actually looked like. She described a building so large that new staff were given printed maps on their first day, with specific recommended routes between commonly used wards, because it was genuinely possible to get lost. She described entire wings she worked in for years without ever once seeing the patients housed in wings on the opposite end of the complex, despite technically working at the same institution. "People ask me what Ashworth was like," she said, in a passage from the interview later published in a regional history journal, "and the honest answer is, I can only tell you what my little corner of it was like, because nobody, including the superintendent himself, really knew the whole place. It was too big for any one person to know." Thackeray's interview also offers a rare, detailed account of the institution's internal social structure, a hierarchy that, by her description, mirrored a small city far more than it resembled a hospital. Senior physicians and the superintendent's family occupied comfortable housing near the main administrative building, with their own household staff drawn from among lower-paid asylum employees. Ward attendants and nurses, predominantly women, lived in dormitory-style housing on the property itself, a common arrangement at institutions of this scale that meant staff rarely left the grounds even on their limited time off, since the surrounding area offered little beyond the asylum complex itself. Thackeray described a kind of insular, all-consuming community life that developed among staff as a result. Friendships, romances, eventually marriages, all formed within the boundaries of an institution that, in her words, became the whole world for a lot of us, whether we meant for it to or not. She also described, with evident discomfort even decades later, the institution's internal patient labor system, which by the 1950s and 1960s had become essential to the facility's basic operation. Patients deemed capable of work, a designation that, by Thackeray's account, was applied somewhat inconsistently and occasionally to patients who, in her professional judgment even at the time, probably shouldn't have been assigned heavy labor, worked the institution's farm, laundry, kitchens, and maintenance crews, providing a substantial portion of the unpaid labor that kept operating costs manageable for a facility this size. "We called it work therapy," Thackeray said in the interview, "and for some folks, I do believe it helped. Gave them purpose, something to do with their hands and their day. But I won't pretend it wasn't also just free labor for an institution that never had enough money to operate any other way. Both things were true at the same time." This scale created problems that smaller institutions, however badly run, simply didn't face in the same way. Record keeping, already inconsistent at most asylums of this era, became genuinely chaotic at a facility processing intake and discharge paperwork for a population this large. Surviving administrative records from the 1940s and 1950s show repeated internal memos flagging discrepancies between official patient counts and physical head counts, sometimes by margins in the hundreds, not because of any single dramatic event, but simply because keeping accurate, centralized records for a population this size, using the paper-based systems of the era, was a task the institution's own administrative capacity was never fully able to match. One administrator who spent considerable effort trying to address this exact problem was a record supervisor named Dorothea Vance, who joined Ashworth's administrative staff in 1961 and spent the next 2 decades attempting to modernize and centralize the institution's patient filing system, an effort that, by her own account, in a brief 1979 interview given to a state government newsletter profiling long-serving public employees, never came close to fully succeeding given the scale of the backlog she inherited. Vance estimated, in that interview, that when she began her position, the institution's records department was operating with a documented backlog of patient files numbering in the thousands, files that had been created at intake but never properly filed, cross-referenced, or in some cases even fully completed, simply because the volume of new admissions had consistently outpaced the administrative staff's capacity to process them. Vance's efforts, while incomplete, did produce one of the more significant surviving achievements connected to Ashworth's history, a partial, hand-built cross-reference index completed in stages throughout the 1960s and 1970s. That allowed researchers decades later to connect a meaningful portion of the institution's surviving records to identifiable individual patients, an index that, while far from comprehensive, remains, according to the preservation group that now holds Ashworth's surviving archive, one of the single most valuable tools available for anyone trying to research the institution's history today. She did, by hand, over 20 years, what should have required a computer system the state never bothered to fund, the preservation group's lead archivist noted in a 2018 presentation on the collection. Without Dorothea Vance's index, a significant portion of what we know about individual patients at Ashworth simply wouldn't be knowable at all. Vance's efforts, while incomplete, did produce one of the more significant surviving achievements connected to Ashworth's history, a partial, hand-built cross-reference index completed in stages throughout the 1960s and 1970s that allowed researchers decades later to connect a meaningful portion of the institution's surviving records to identifiable individual patients, an index that, while far from comprehensive, remains, according to the preservation group that now holds Ashworth's surviving archive, one of the single most valuable tools available for anyone trying to research the institution's history today. She did, by hand, over 20 years, what should have required a computer system the state never bothered to fund. The preservation group's lead archivist noted in a 2018 presentation on the collection. Without Dorothea Vance's index, a significant portion of what we know about individual patients at Ashworth simply wouldn't be knowable at all. It's worth dwelling on one specific patient whose file, thanks to Vance's index, researchers were able to trace in unusual detail. A man named Bertram Holloway, admitted to Ashworth in 1942 at the age of 28, whose case has become, for researchers studying the institution, something of a representative window into what an ordinary multi-decade commitment at a facility this size actually looked like from the inside. Holloway's commitment record describes a diagnosis of shell shock, the era's terminology for what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress, following his service in the early years of American involvement in the Second World War, a diagnosis his surviving family later confirmed followed a combat injury that left him, in his sister's words from a 1989 interview, not the same man who'd left. Holloway spent the next 31 years as a patient at Ashworth, moved across no fewer than 6 different wards over that span as the institution's internal classification of his condition shifted, worked for a period in the institution's print shop, producing official forms and stationery, and according to the partial records, Vance's index helped researchers locate. Corresponded regularly with his sister for the first decade of his commitment before the letters, for reasons the surviving record doesn't explain, simply stop. He was discharged in 1973, at the age of 59, as part of the broader deinstitutionalization wave sweeping the facility during that decade, and lived an additional 11 years in a community care facility before his death in 1984. His sister, interviewed 5 years later, reflected on visiting him sporadically over those 3 decades, describing the difficulty of watching someone she loved grow old inside a building so large that, in her words, you could drive for 10 minutes inside the property before you even reached his ward, like visiting somebody who lived in his own small town instead of a hospital. Holloway's case, ordinary as it is in many respects compared to some of the more dramatic stories we've covered on this channel, may be in some ways the most representative thing about Ashworth's actual history, not a single dramatic event, but 3 decades of an ordinary life, quietly absorbed into an institution so vast that even the people who loved him experienced his commitment as something closer to him moving to a different, distant place than to him being a patient down the hall. Ashworth's decline, like so many comparable institutions, came gradually rather than all at once, tracking the broader national deinstitutionalization movement that accelerated through the 1960s and 1970s. By 1975, the population had fallen to under 3,000. By 1990, fewer than 400 patients remained, occupying only a handful of the complex's original 70-plus buildings, the rest standing empty, unheated, and slowly beginning the long process of decay that now defines the property's reputation. The facility finally closed entirely in 1996, its last remaining patients transferred to smaller, more modern community-based facilities scattered across the state. The closure itself, unlike the chaotic, rushed closures we've discussed in other institutions' histories on this channel, was by most accounts a comparatively orderly process, planned over several years rather than executed in a matter of months, a difference that researchers attribute partly to the lessons the state's mental health system had learned from earlier, more poorly managed institutional closures elsewhere, and partly simply to the practical necessity of an extended timeline given the sheer logistical challenge of transferring, even gradually, a population that had once numbered in the thousands. Surviving transfer records from this final period are, by the standards of this kind of institutional history, unusually thorough, accounting for the vast majority of Ashworth's final patient population by name, diagnosis, and receiving facility, though the preservation group's archivists note that this final era thoroughness stands in notable contrast to the documentary chaos of the institution's earlier, more overcrowded decades, when record-keeping simply could not keep pace with the population it was meant to track. What makes Ashworth distinctive today, more than 2 decades after its closure, isn't a single unresolved mystery in the way some comparable institutions' stories are built around one. It's the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of what remained standing. Unlike many abandoned asylums that were demolished relatively quickly after closure, Ashworth's enormous footprint and the sheer cost of demolishing more than 70 separate structures has meant that the vast majority of the complex still stands today, mostly fenced, mostly inaccessible to the public, slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding forest in a process that preservation architects who've studied the site describe as one of the largest examples of institutional ruin anywhere in the country. 2 of Ashworth's specialized facilities deserve particular mention because they illustrate just how far the institution's mandate had expanded beyond its original purpose by the mid-20th century. The tuberculosis ward, constructed in 1919 in response to a national health crisis that disproportionately affected institutionalized populations living in close quarters, operated as a semi-independent facility within the broader complex, housing at its own peak in the late 1920s and early 1930s well over 400 patients simultaneously, many of whom had been transferred there not for any psychiatric condition at all, but simply because Ashworth's tuberculosis facility was, for a period, one of the only specialized treatment options available in that part of the state. Surviving mortality records from this ward, preserved more completely than many of the institution's other records due to public health reporting requirements that existed independently of the asylum's own internal documentation, show a mortality rate during the ward's peacetime peak years that researchers studying the facility have described as consistent with, though not dramatically worse than, comparable tuberculosis sanatoriums of the era nationally, a grim statistic, but one that reflects the genuine limits of available medical treatment for the disease during this period, rather than any specific failure unique to Ashworth. The forensic unit, established in 1931 to house patients committed through the criminal court system, operated under a different and in some ways even more troubling set of circumstances, given that commitment to this unit often meant indefinite confinement without the same legal protections, however minimal, that even a criminal conviction would have provided. Surviving case files from this unit, where they exist, document individuals held for decades following relatively minor offenses. Their continued confinement justified not by any specific ongoing treatment plan, but by periodic, often cursory psychiatric evaluations that simply recommended continued institutionalization without substantial elaboration. A 2014 academic study examining a sample of surviving forensic unit case files found that the average documented length of confinement for patients committed to this specific unit between 1931 and 1970 exceeded 19 years. A figure the study's authors noted was, in a significant number of cases, dramatically disproportionate to the severity of the original offense that had led to commitment. In the first place, the property's afterlife has also, like several other institutions we've covered, generated its own substantial body of urban exploration photography and video documentation over the past 2 decades, with Ashworth's sheer scale making it a particularly significant site within that community specifically. Entire forums and photo archives are dedicated exclusively to documenting different sections of the complex, with some explorers specializing in particular buildings or wings, simply because no single visit could ever hope to cover the entire 400-acre site. This sustained documentation has, as with comparable sites, produced both genuine architectural and historical preservation value and, increasingly, a layer of exaggerated or invented folklore that the preservation group has, in public statements, specifically pushed back against, emphasizing that the institution's real documented history, overcrowding on a scale almost without parallel in American institutional history, chronic underfunding, and the quiet, decades-long labor of people like Iris Thackeray and Dorothea Vance simply trying to do right by an impossible number of patients with inadequate resources, is itself remarkable enough without embellishment. I wanted to see what remained for myself. So, on a cold morning this past winter, I made the drive out to the property, having arranged, through a local preservation group that now holds limited access rights, to walk a small supervised section of the grounds. We're standing right now at what used to be the edge of the main administrative complex, and even from here, you can get a sense of the scale of this place that's honestly hard to convey on camera. That building behind me, that's just one of more than 70 that used to stand on this property, and it alone is bigger than most entire schools I've ever set foot in. The man who runs the preservation tour here told me that on a clear day, from the upper floors of the main building, you can see clear across the property to buildings nearly half a mile away, and that even after working here for over a decade documenting the site, he still occasionally finds rooms, records, entire sections of basement storage he hadn't fully cataloged before. He also told me something that's stuck with me since, that the preservation group's biggest ongoing challenge isn't structural decay, which they expected, but simply the scale of the documentation effort itself. Ashworth generated, over its 122 years of operation, an estimated several million individual pages of patient and administrative records, the overwhelming majority of which were left in the buildings when they closed, exposed decades of weather and decay before any organized recovery effort began. Volunteers have been working through what survives for over 15 years now, and by the preservation group's own estimate, they've cataloged less than a third of it. We walked, under close supervision, through a small section of what used to be one of the institution's dormitory wards, and I have to say, photographs really don't prepare you for the scale of an empty hallway like this one, stretching further than the light from my camera could really reach, door after door after door, each one leading to a room that, for someone, once was the only home they had. The preservation guide pointed out, in one of the rooms we passed, a row of small numbered hooks still mounted on the wall, exactly the kind of detail that's easy to walk past but that, once you really look at it, tells you everything about how a building meant to be a hospital ended up, by sheer necessity of scale. Organizing human beings the way you might organize inventory. He also showed me a section of the basement archive where Dorothea Vance's original hand-built index cards are still stored, boxes upon boxes of them, each card representing one patient, painstakingly cross-referenced by hand over 2 decades by a single woman trying to bring some order to a system that had simply outgrown anyone's ability to manage it. Standing in that basement, looking at thousands of index cards stretching back into the dim light, it was hard not to think about just how much individual, careful human effort it took just to make this place even partially knowable to the people who'd come looking for answers decades later. Further along the tour, we passed through what remains of the institution's old print shop, the same one where Bertram Holloway worked for a period during his 3 decades as a patient, and the guide mentioned that volunteers had, just the previous year, recovered several boxes of printed forms and stationery still sitting on shelves exactly where they'd been left in 1996. The institution's own letterhead, complete with its full name and motto, never used, simply abandoned along with everything else when the last patients and staff finally walked out. There's something particular about standing in a room like that, surrounded by paperwork that was meant for a future the institution never got to have. That's hard to put into words even now. We also passed, toward the end of the supervised section, the remains of what had once been the institution's chapel, a modest, simply built structure compared to the grandeur of the main administrative building, but one the guide described as having held a particular significance for many patients and staff alike across the decades. Hosting services for multiple denominations on a rotating basis, given the practical impossibility of building separate chapels for every faith represented among a population this large. The pews are mostly gone now, removed decades ago, but the stained glass in several of the windows remarkably survives, casting fractured, colored light across a floor otherwise thick with dust and fallen plaster. The guide told me that of everywhere on the property, the chapel is the one space he's never quite gotten used to walking through alone, not because of anything he'd call genuinely unsettling, but simply because of what it represents, the one place on 400 acres that was built, deliberately, to be about something other than the institution's own enormous administrative machinery, the one place that was meant, even within a system this vast and impersonal, to treat each person who walked through its doors as something more than a number on an index card. I'll leave you with this. When people talk about Ashworth, the conversation usually starts and ends with its size, the biggest, the largest, the most. And that's a real and significant part of its story. But standing out there this winter, walking past building after building after building, each one of them once full of real people living real lives, however difficult those lives were, I found myself thinking less about the scale of the place and more about just how many individual stories must still be sitting in those uncatalogued records. How many Iris Thackeray's, how many Dorothea Vance's, how many Bertram Holloways, how many patients whose names we'll never know are still waiting, more than a century after the first foundation was poured, for somebody to finally read their file all the way through. There's a strange kind of arithmetic to a place like Ashworth that I don't think I fully appreciated until I stood there myself. 10,000 patients at its peak sounds, when you first hear it, like an abstraction, a number too large to really hold on to. But every one of those 10,000 had a name, a family, a life before the gravel drive, and a life, however changed, after it. Dr. Pierce built this place, decade after decade, convinced he was solving a humanitarian crisis, and in some real sense, he was. The alternative, for many of these patients, genuinely was a county jail cell or a locked attic room with no medical care at all. But the solution he built grew so large that, by his own admission in that 1924 letter, even he could no longer claim to fully understand what was happening inside it. That tension between genuine, well-intentioned reform and the sheer, crushing impersonality of scale might be the truest thing anyone could say about Ashworth, and maybe about the entire era of American institutional history it represents. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you, stick around. There are more forgotten places like this one scattered across the country, and I'd be glad to have you along as we find the next one.